This is a production of Cornell University.
Question.
You said that nitrogen will get immobilized with a high C/N ratio for short term. What would you classify as short term?
Okay, so the question was the nitrogen with a high C/N ratio, the nitrogen is going to be immobilized for a short period of time. What in fact is that period of time? I do not have an answer for that one.
But in general.
So how long is it? How long are we going to have this nitrogen deficiency issue? If it's in a garden, it's less than a season. If it's a lot of organic matter, it also is going to have to do with how much organic matter you add in. But it's not. There's often you'll see in these garden magazines that the gray literature. Does anybody read garden magazines? It's another. I'm just the only geek that does that. Okay. There's a lot of literature out there that says, if you add woody chips to your soils, you have to fertilize because your plants are going to be hit because they're not going to have any nitrogen. Well, it's not necessarily true because it's usually a localized effect. Okay, so if I put woody chips up here, my localized nitrogen deficiency is not going to be all the way down here. It's just going to be very local. Okay, so and usually within the year, usually within the growing season, the plants are fine. Now that's not to say that the plants themselves aren't going to be mining for nitrogen as well. So that's not to say that if I put woody chips on the top, I don't have to fertilize. If I put woody chips up here, I might actually be putting in some other types of organic matter that are going to decompose faster so they can provide nitrogen, because when those plants are in there, they're going to be sucking up nutrients, nitrogen being one of them. Does that make sense to everybody?
So mulching shouldn't immobilize?
When you mulching should not immobilize at any kind of rate that is going to be problematic for plants. Now, when you start integrating that, and that mulch starts to decompose, and you start integrating, and you put more mulch in there, yeah, you're going to have those localized temporary nitrogen deficiencies. And they do exist. But if you're aware of them, you can manage for them. Okay, questions? We good with this? Go.
Doesn't it depend what CN ratio in terms of what plants are growing?
Okay, so the question is, doesn't it matter what kind of plants that you have in location? And yeah, that's definitely the case. And it matters what kind of mulch you're using. I could put a allelopathic type up here too, but that has nothing to do with the CN ratio. It depends on what I'm using for my mulch. There's grass mulches, there's wood chip mulches, there's all different kinds of mulches, and it also depends on the type of plant. If I'm putting in, if they're young seedlings and things like that, that may be more problematic than a more established azalea or rhododendron or something like that. Does that make sense? If I'm putting in seeds into wood chips, one should expect you're going to have problems. On the other hand, if I'm putting in seedlings or something like that, less of a problem. It's where those plants are trying to harvest their nutrients, and if they're in that nitrogen deficiency zone, you should expect to see them having problems because the microbes are much better at getting it than they are. Question?
Yeah. Wood has a 130 to 400 carbon nitrogen ratio, so it would have a lot of nitrogen.
No, it would not have a lot of nitrogen. Have a lot of carbon to nitrogen. The first number is always carbon. So if this is 400, that's 400 carbon to 1 nitrogen.
Oh, I thought that was 130.
Yeah, sorry.
Does it matter how the organic matter is incorporated into the soil?
So the question was, does it matter how the organic matter is incorporated into the soil? And often it does, but that's a management decision. If you're putting all of your organic matter on the surface, that's going to be where the organic matter is going to be first reacting. If you integrate it in, it's a different matter. And so we often just sort of put the organic matter on the top and let the organisms do the transportation. The worms will bring it down. As they decompose, the material gets decomposed, it gets smaller, and it will start moving down as well. The organisms themselves will move down there, and they are part of this biomass as well. But it's really an issue of what you're trying to grow and what you're trying to not necessarily grow, but what you're trying to do with that organic matter. Does that sort of answer that? I'm not sure it does, but okay. Any other questions on this one? Do we feel pretty comfortable with this? So I put this slide in here just sort of as a summary slide, and basically you have two different materials here. Up here is a high CN ratio, down here is a low CN ratio. And you've seen these graphs before. This is when I showed the CO2 evolution and decomposition. Okay, so this black line here, up here and here is basically the CO2 evolution. Okay, basically it represents the activity microbial community. Okay, it's their respiration. As it increases, the population is more active. Okay, and we usually associate that with a larger population. Okay, granted it could be one really large microbe, but okay. The green line that you see there, here, right here, and right here, that's the CN ratio of the material. So here it starts very high, here it starts fairly low. Okay? This green line that's underneath the green shade, that basically represents the amount of nitrogen that's released into the system. Okay? So as that nitrogen comes down, there's less nitrogen in the system. Now they're looking at nitrate, but nitrate is one form of nitrogen. Okay? As that line gets down, the available nitrogen in the system is depressed. As it goes up, the available nitrogen is increased. Right? Okay, so if I start with a high CN ratio, fresh added material right here, you can see my population just boom, but you can also see my nitrate being depressed. Now this is the nitrate that's in the soil, not the nitrate that's in the nitrogen that's in the CN, not in the plant material that they're eating. Okay, so they're harvesting this nitrogen from someplace else, the soil. Okay, as time goes on, the population decreases, the CN ratio of the material also decreases, and somewhere down the line, that nitrogen that's in the soil, that's available nitrogen, starts to increase again. The populations are crashing. Okay, they're dying. They're releasing their nitrogen. On the other hand, low CN ratio material, population does the same bop, comes up, okay? But you can notice because the CN ratio is so low, the nitrogen is basically waste material in the carbon, in that food that they're eating. They don't need that much. But remember this, okay? If my CN ratio is too low, I have to be blowing off CO2, I have to be making ATP, all these other things. Okay, I have waste material. And that waste material is represented in the increase of the nitrogen. It's just available. Now that's available to all the other organisms, the plants, that are in that system. Does that make sense to everybody? No? Yes? Questions? Cool.
Where's the original source of nitrogen?
The original source of nitrogen would have been someplace back here, some other organic matter that got added to the system. Now, it also could be nitrogen fixation, but it's nitrogen that was added previously through organic matter amendments. Okay, so imagine I had a leaf fall back here. Okay, and then we're basically looking this at the next fall. Okay, in the next fall, I've got leaves going in. The leaves have a fairly low CN ratio compared to wood. Okay, this was a tree fall. This was a leaf fall. Okay, so this pool is starting at the same, basically the same spot because of the history of the site. Does that make sense, Lucas? Yeah. Okay. Go.
So the nitrate depression period, is that the nitrates in the rest of the soil that the microbes are actually feeding off of? They don't have enough.
That's the nitrate. So this nitrate depression period. So that's this nitrate that came in prior to the food. This is with the soil. Okay, this is here already. This is not coming with the food stock. Okay, the food stock hits the ground. The organisms are going to start eating it. It's energy. But they don't have enough nutrients in that food stock. And so they're going to harvest other locations, which is going to be the nitrate that's in the soil.
So is that what you were talking about when you said like a nitrogen deficiency?
This would be a good example of a nitrogen deficiency. The microbe, so this is the example of nitrogen deficiency. If this nitrate pool is depressed because the microbes are getting it, and they are much better at getting it than everybody else is now going to have deficiency in nitrate. Does that make sense? Now, somewhere down the line, those organisms are going to start dying off. And once they start dying off, the CN ratios of the material that's being decomposed is going to start rising, or lowering, I should say. And as a result, nitrogen is going to be put into the soil, which then everybody else can get. Now, it should be noted that this is a very localized event. Where that food is where the decomposition is going to occur. It's not like they're going to go out to the Quickie Mart to get nitrogen. Okay? If the food is here, they're going to be depressed. The nitrogen is going to be being depressed in this zone. Okay? If the material is a high CN ratio material. If, on the other hand, the CN ratio of the material is actually fairly low, this is where the nitrogen is going to be released. It's going to be fairly localized. Okay? The nitrogen isn't going to start, well, it does actually migrate, but the nitrogen is not necessarily going to get over to the plant over there. It's going to be the plant that's over here that benefits from it. I.e., when you put in organic matter as fertilizer, you put your organic matter near where the organisms are that you want to take advantage of it. I don't put my compost over here and plant my corn over there and expect to get any response from it. Does that make sense? And that is actually a very good example of why location matters when you start talking about decomposition. Question?
So how does this work with nitrogen-fixing organisms?
How does this work with nitrogen-fixing organisms? So this is actually a really good example. In this type of environment, nitrogen-fixing organisms don't have an advantage. Nitrogen fixation. So the question is, how does this relate to nitrogen fixation? Microbes, there are a lot of organisms out there that have the ability to fix nitrogen. They take it from its mineral form and they immobilize it. They put it into a form that organisms can use. And we'll talk about this later in the semester as well. But to do that, it takes ATP. It takes energy. So if there is nitrogen that's readily available in the environment, this is no benefit to them whatsoever. Why should they waste energy if nitrogen is already there? Make sense? On the other hand, in a scenario like this, where nitrogen is in competition, they can basically take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and fix it into a biologically usable form. That's a severe advantage, a significant, not a severe, well, it is severe, a severe advantage in this type of environment. Because there are a lot of organisms that can't fix nitrogen. And if you are an organism that can fix it, can take it out of the atmosphere and put it into a biomass form, you have a severe advantage. These guys, most of these guys are taking the nitrogen that's in here is already in an organic form. It's in a form that organisms can use. But if I get rid of that, there's nothing there for them to use. So in that case, those organisms that have the ability to take N2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into an ammonium form, an amine form, that's a huge advantage. Now, we really are going to be talking about nitrogen later in the semester, but does everybody have an idea about what I mean when I say they're fixing nitrogen? Sort of, ish? I'm uncomfortable with the nodding that I'm getting here. So let me show you. We'll do this real quick, and we'll talk about it later, a lot later in the semester. The nitrogen cycle we're not going to talk about right now, but there's basically, for lack of a better, there's basically two forms of nitrogen that organisms can use, and they'll convert it into amines. And the amine is basically a form that's like this. Okay, and it's attached to a carbon structure, it's part of the body. Okay, but they're doing it. They're basically taking these two forms. Now, not all organisms have the ability to take each one of these forms, but plants do have the ability to take either one of these forms. Okay, this is the nitrogen that's being released through decomposition, and it's coming out in these forms, which plants can then take up. But there is an abundance of this in the atmosphere. What is it, 80%, 79%? Whatever. There's this huge number of nitrogen in the atmosphere, except it's in an unavailable form. The plants can't take it up. But there are organisms that can basically convert this nitrogen into these forms for use. Actually, they've converted it into this form for use. Now, most of them are in symbiotic relationships with plants, where the plants are giving them carbon or energy, And the microorganisms that are doing the fixing are giving the plants the nitrogen. Okay? But if this is the nitrogen that is not available here, there is an abundance of this nitrogen, N2 gas, in this environment, even when the nitrate is depressed. So as a result, the organisms that can do that, they'll do this, and they'll survive. The organisms that can't do that and aren't as good as the microbes at getting this, they're basically going to go into senescence and potentially die. Does that make sense? Questions? Go.
I think I understand this concept, but why do some of the bacterial microorganisms prefer legumes as opposed to corn?
I don't know if it's that they prefer it, but the relationship for nitrogen fixation has developed in the legumes while it hasn't developed in the corn. The symbiotic relationship between the microbial population and the corn, it's never been developed. On the other hand, I mean, got a good analogy here. Good analogy. I can't think of a good analogy for this. It's like pizza and beer. It goes really well together. Beer and cake doesn't go that well together. That's a really terrible one. The microbial population that has the ability to fix nitrogen, some of them live by themselves, but some of these guys have developed relationships with certain plants, and corn happens not to be one of those plants. There's a whole slew of different types of plants. It's not just legumes. There's some trees and some other organisms, and there's also some fungi type of relationships as well. But corn just happens not to be one of them. My good case for GMOs. I knew you were going to go there. We were just talking about GMOs earlier, but we're not going to go that direction. Okay, I think question, but does that make sense to you? Kind of?
Yeah, but I guess.
Yeah, but
Why? I still don't understand.
the beer and pizza one, that makes sense, right? Okay, any other questions on this one? We're fairly good with this? All right.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.